Hi, friends. I recently had a very interesting conversation with Dr. Ryan Danker, who is a professor of church history at Wesley Theological Seminary. He's an expert on Methodist history, John Wesley, and particularly certain themes related to what is generally known as political theology. Political theology. Given everything that's going on in our culture right now, I think it would be really interesting and useful for us to think about how Christian faith informs us as we consider how to be responsible citizens in the world. Ryan has some really interesting points of view on this, and it's a way of thinking about history and how history helps us think about the present. So I invite you to have a listen, and I hope you find it edifying. Hello, friends. Today I am here with my friend, Dr. Ryan Danker, who is Associate Professor of Church History and Methodist Studies at Wesley Theological Seminary in Washington, D.C. He's the author recently of a couple of books, one, Wesley and the Anglicans, Political Divisions in Early Evangelicalism, and then he is the general editor for a book entitled Exploring a Wesleyan Political Theology. And I have really enjoyed numerous conversations with Ryan over various sorts of beverages in various academic meetings and
all over the world.
In a month-long collaboration at Duke Divinity School one summer a few years ago. So it's good to see you, Ryan, and thank you for indulging me in this conversation.
Well, thanks for the invite, Steve. It's good to see you.
Good. All right. Well, we're in a really tense time when the word politics gets thrown around lots of different ways. And in the church, people occasionally run into this term. Academics use it all the time, this term political theology, but a lot of us, we're not quite sure what that word would mean. So let's start with you giving us a good definition. What is political theology?
Well, I think the easiest way to approach this is to simply say that the gospel has social repercussions. So the message of Jesus, the creation of the church, the salvation of souls isn't something that only affects the individual. It's something that changes the culture, it changes the society. And that change, desire to change something outside of ourselves, is political theology. And so I think that's the best way to come at it. I mean, we could give some academic description, but I thought something useful might be in order.
Yeah.
The gospel has repercussions. What are they, and how are they inspired by the gospel? That's political theology.
Okay. Well, that right away brings the question to mind. Okay, we can accept this definition as kind of a theoretical principle. And yeah, Christians sort of know this about the gospel. And yet there's this thing called separation of church and state. There's been a lot of back and forth about how much a person's religious viewpoints should work into their policy decisions. And those are public officials, of course. But Christians, I think, generally have been schooled in this idea that, well, yeah, the Christian faith has these implications, we know, but aren't there some limits that should be kept in place? And then conversely, should we be questioning those limits as Christians?
As Wesleyans, the answer is no. As a Wesleyan, you actually cannot possibly make such divisions between what's going on in your heart and what comes out in your life. Now, there are certain theologies. I mean, the Lutheran theology would allow for what they call a two kingdoms approach that would separate some of the moral accountability of the individual, whether that individual is working. If that individual is working for the state and acting in the name of the state, then the moral accountability of the individual Christian is not expected of that person. Methodists have never had any idea that should be the case. And in fact, given our doctrine of Christian perfection, that you need to be entirely made over by the holy love of God, the idea of separating that new life in you from the way you deal with people. It just doesn't fly. And so from the Wesleyan perspective, no. Now, I realize the Baptists are the biggest promoters of a concept of separation in church and state. Mm-hmm. It's not in the U.S. Constitution, although some people think it is.
Right.
And for them, that was a reaction to the fact that they were oppressed by the established church in England, and they wanted to, in this country, they wanted to make sure that there was a distinction between what they did as the church and what the government did as the government. Again, Wesleyans or Methodists, we just don't have that kind of thinking. We were a part of the establishment until we decided to leave. Mm-hmm. And in many places in the country, we still kind of sit in an establishmentarian kind of position. Mm-hmm. In some parts. Anyway, I think when it comes down to it, though, and this is silly, but as you were asking that question, I got the song in my head, "This Little Light of Mine," you know. Can you hide it under a bushel? No. Right. And so a coherent political theology, especially from a Wesleyan perspective, would say you can't put these markers to say, oh, you can be a Christian, but only up to this point. No, I'm sorry. You have to, in fact, be a Christian still.
Everywhere, all the time, yeah.
All the time.
Yeah.
And it's not just because you're following some legalistic code. It's because you've experienced the new birth. The new life of God is in you. You're changed. So how could you not? I challenged a Methodist politician on this very point here in Washington once. He gave me a look. I told him, I said, "Senator, you don't sound like a Methodist right now."
Well, yeah, I could tell you a story about that more locally. I will not, but maybe some other time. I got told once, I will say this, I got told once, "You're not really very Methodist, are you? You probably should leave."
Oh.
Yeah, there's a certain irony in the backstory there. So, but
right,
we'll leave that one alone.
There's the headline: Steve Rankin, not a Methodist.
Not a Methodist. I'm not a real Methodist. Yeah. Well, back to the point here.
All right, yeah.
So, again, definition matters, and I think thoughtful people need to think about these things. Separation of church and state, we know, obviously refers to the fact that in the United States, the state doesn't sponsor any particular religion and doesn't favor any particular religion. Right. To that, we could agree. But the idea that our faith can't enter into the public arena, can't participate in public debate or public matters of any sort, it's just impossible for Christians. Yeah. Other than the qualification you made earlier about Luther's thinking, but Christians really enter into these public conversations about big issues as Christians and as Methodist Christians.
Absolutely. I mean, and I think we need to fight against the idea that we should be compartmentalized on a number of levels. First of all, it's not healthy mentally. But second of all, it's essentially telling Christians you can be seen but not heard. And that doesn't fly. And we shouldn't put up with that.
Right.
So, your faith is not simply an ideology or a set of beliefs. Your faith is who you are. Mm. And so, anyway, we've kind of gone on that point. But
worked on that one. All right.
Hopefully your hearers can hear what I'm saying. Don't stop being a Christian in public, ever.
That's right. That's good. Yeah. Well, we may have answered this in a way already, but let me go ahead and ask it. And that is, what is distinctive about Methodist political theology?
Well, so I think it depends on the era that we're talking about. In the book that I edited, the chapter I wrote was essentially saying that early Methodism, so the Methodism that you find under John Wesley himself, although it wasn't a political movement necessarily, because they created societies. So pockets or cells throughout England where, yes, they were supposed to hear about the new birth. Yes, they were supposed to go on to perfection and experience it in this life. Let's add that to it. The one of the caveats around their idea of community is to watch over one another in love. That's a classic Wesleyan phrase, to watch over one another in love. And it refers to the class meetings. You would actually check on one another every week. How are you doing? What, is the roof still leaking? Do we need to call people in to help you with this? How's your health? And then the other questions, of course, did you sin today? Mm-hmm. Was your first thought upon, right when you woke up, was your first thought about God? But they were watching over one another in love. And so I argued in that particular chapter that the earliest Methodists created communities of the new birth who then mirrored to the society the way society should actually function and care for one another. It's a very localized political vision. And because in our country, I think some of the fundamental differences in political philosophy is to argue whether it's federal control or local control or federal money or local money. Well, at a certain point, Wesley stopped trying to rely on the big name politicians to push things through. It's interesting because at one point, because the different monarchs of England had different, given their political role at the time, they would lean toward the Tories or they would lean toward the Whigs, the different political parties of the day. And, John Wesley was born under Queen Anne, who was just the Tory party's absolute favorite person ever. But he started his ministry under George II. And George II, just like George I, really sided with the Whigs. And the Wesleys were not Whigs, they were Tories. And we'll talk about that in another question. But essentially, John Wesley was waiting for the heir to the throne, who would have been George III had he lived, waiting for the heir to the throne to take over from George II, because the heir to the throne had Tory inclinations. Well, so the Prince of Wales died in a freak accident. In fact, some accounts say that he died by tennis ball. And of course, in the 18th century, a tennis ball isn't the thing we have now. It's much harder, kind of, you hear that and you think death by tennis ball. But he died, and this is in the 1750s. And after that point, what you see in Wesley is he stops relying on political figures to carry out what he thinks is the vision for the country. Instead, he goes deeper and he dives in and says, all right, we need to change people's hearts and put them in communities where they'll actually watch over one another in love. And that was his political statement after he'd given up on these grandiose ideas around the heir to the throne. So I think that is distinct. I think it's also saying, in a certain way, to modern Methodists, you want society to look a certain way? Well, make your church look like that first. What does your local church look like? Do you care for the poor in your local church? Those would be good questions for Methodists as they're trying to think of a political action that they want to take. Do they want to work to help unwed mothers? Do they want to help people move away from the abortion clinic? Do they what are they doing? And are they doing it in their own community as well? So that would be a political theology inspired by early Methodism.
So there's an analogy here, it seems to me, like if all politics is local, in a sense, I'm using this in a very loose way, but all ecclesiology is local in that same sense too. And to be honest, I've been thinking about a portion of this conversation for a while now, as the social fabric of our country seems to be unraveling. I think it's all the more important for congregations to take up true spiritual leadership, and I'm using those words very purposefully, that I don't mean grabbing power. I mean serving in the community and leading, but that we have to do this as Christians.
Yeah.
Again, we can't obey all the laws and deal with policies and whatever restrictions we might encounter there. But the church at the local level, I think, especially now, needs to step forward as having a vision for the common good of the community from a Christian gospel point of view.
Right. And also, and I think this is helpful in our context. So Methodists and Wesleyans believe, just like Christians everywhere, that all persons are made in the image of God. That should be the primary way in which we interact with somebody who disagrees with us about a political topic. You're speaking to someone who is made in the image of God. That was the driving force behind early Methodism's abolitionism. You cannot enslave one who is made in the image of God. That was Wesley's argument. It wasn't, this is wrong, this is economically unviable, you shouldn't, those things came out later, but the initial core of the argument is this person's made in the image of God. You cannot enslave him, you cannot enslave her. And likewise, when we're speaking to each other, and I think this is something that Christians in general in this country need to start mirroring to the culture again. How do we speak to each other about matters of the church in such a way that the culture will look at us and say, they actually still love one another. Mm-hmm. They still respect one another. That would be quite the testimony, I think, in our day and age.
Yeah, we have some sin to confess on that one, don't we?
Yeah, we do. Yeah.
Well, so politics and political theory. In a way, this circles back a bit to previous part of the conversation, but I'm aware that people lapse into certain modalities. Mm-hmm. So when I start thinking about politics, who should I vote for? How should I think about the current Supreme Court nominee? All these things, we lapse into modalities. And it seems to me that Christians are as guilty as anyone if, when we do that, we sort of leave all our Christian character, all our Christian thinking. I mean, it's not gone, but it's so sublimated somehow that it doesn't seem very, very functional. So what guidance could we Methodists get from our tradition for navigating this really intense, fragmented, hostile political environment we live in now?
I don't think we should be detached, because that's not Wesleyan. Wesleyans were the ones on horseback riding out, into the far reaches. But I think we should be more guarded with the way we identify ourselves. I am a baptized child of God. That is my, big word. That's the ontological reality in me. It's the same as in you. You are a baptized child of God. And that makes a difference. That makes a huge difference in the way that that we should understand our role in the world. Somebody who's baptized has been baptized into the death and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Mm-hmm. Therefore, you are no longer, and I think, if St. Paul was writing today, he could probably say, you are no longer a Republican or a Democrat, no longer a liberal or a conservative. You are a new creation. And I think we seem to have forgotten that in some of our dialogue outside in the world, especially in the political realm. The current nominee for the Supreme Court. okay, there's, various issues there at play. There's even the basic issue of whether we think that these proceedings should be going on. I guess one party thinks no. There's questions of, well, 20, 30 years ago, we just didn't do this to nominees, there's things like that. But stepping back a little bit, I think the question that a Christian needs to ask is not, do I dislike this person simply because of who nominated her? Or do I just like this person simply because of who nominated her? That's not the way we should be thinking. That's tribalism. And that's really what I'm getting after. Christians are not part of a different tribe. They're not a part of some political tribe. They are baptized into the death and resurrection of Christ. And I know that's easier said than done. And there are certain things that certain political movements in this country do that should make Christians upset, no matter what their political perspective. But at the same time, the rise of tribalism related to political ideology is dangerous for Christians. If your theology is now based off of your political ideology, you don't have a political theology. You have a theology. You have a politicized theology.
And
in
it's
fact,
a good distinction. Yeah. Could you say that again, please?
Yeah, if your theology is actually shaped and formed by your politics, then you have a politicized theology. It should be the other way around. Your politics should be shaped and formed by the faith you've received from the church. Let me be even more specific. It's not my theology. I don't have my own theology. God help us. But what we do then with this, my politics shapes my theology, really that's just idolatry. It's just an idol at that point. And so we need to get away from that. And then, then step back as the baptized child of God and say, okay, what are the issues before us? How should a Christian approach this? This is kind of fun. I was riding in a car with an archbishop once. And, as people do, right? You get to do some of the craziest things as academics. We were in North Carolina, and come to find out we were members of different political parties. And he said to me that the driving force behind his political thinking was whenever he voted, he wanted to say that he voted in such a way that he could say his interests corresponded with care for the poor. And I said, I respect that. And I told him, I said, I would hope that my vote and my political interests correspond with the gift of life and defending the lives of all people as valuable. And he said that he thought that was a very good and Christian approach as well. And, who knows if we cancel each other out in the ballot box these days? I have no idea. It was 10 years ago. But I think we acknowledge there were deeper issues here than political membership or tribalism that really were at the heart of what we were trying to do. And in fact, if he and I got together and we said, all right, who can we find to help us understand that life has value at every stage and that we need as Christians to care for the poor? Okay, find that candidate and the two of us will get behind that person.
Right, yeah, exactly.
But not based on party, based on
exactly, not based on party.
Yeah.
Right, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, this raises another question then in my mind. And again, many of us are aware of how things have changed. So our country is divided politically, even geographically. People are moving to neighborhoods and, parties are using their legal power to gerrymander, to protect their places in Congress and elsewhere. Discussions about packing the Supreme Court. I read an article the other day about states where Republican governors have added numbers to their Supreme Courts at the state level in order to do so. It's
Wow.
Again, I'm not making any kind of political editorial comment there. I'm just aware of the animosity now. And whereas at one time, members of a church, as the same congregation, knew there were Republicans and Democrats and independents, other people, and yet loved each other and got along reasonably well. That's what we're really losing, the ability to recognize difference and stay together. This comes back to your point about we're baptized Christians, right? That our primary identity as a person baptized into Christ,
Right.
And that should really mean something. What does it mean? So here, that was a long intro to this question. And I know I'm asking you sort of off the top of your head for this, but again, think about a congregation where we sort of know we've gotten ourselves into this position where we're members of the same church, and yet we kind of hate each other, we can't stand each other.
Right.
But we also have the sense that we need to patch this up and get things back into a proper perspective and try to move forward a little bit. Again, thinking as a Wesleyan, how could we recognize where we've gotten ourselves and draw on our scriptural and theological resources to pull it back to where it ought to be? Maybe I can sharpen it. Is there something we should read in Wesley, or what is there something like that? Is there a resource you would point us to? Again, I'm hitting you cold, I know.
Yeah, no, that's all right. Is there a resource in Wesley about this?
Don't say Catholic Spirit.
No. Well, I mean, that might be a good one. It's actually, I wish people would actually read that sermon rather than just quote snippets of it.
Actually, yes.
This is the most misunderstood sermon he ever wrote.
Right.
Yeah, I got onto Mike McCurry about that the other day. He and I actually did, those who might not remember him, he was the press secretary under Bill Clinton, in the Bill Clinton administration. We're colleagues. And so we've actually done some things in local churches where we're both on stools up front, and we talk politics because we disagree on. Actually, we agree on 90% of it, but we only talk about the 10%. Otherwise, it'd be a boring conversation. So, but yeah, the Catholic Spirit. That's a good one. That is. I'm going to go with that. Okay. I mean, he has other political writings you could read. That'd be fine. If you want to see him go off on the Americans and tell them not to, go into rebellion against the monarchy, you can read about that too. But I think mainly with the Catholic Spirit, what he says there in the sermon is that you have this core, and it's really it is the Orthodox Christian faith. It's that which is outlined by the Nicene Creed. That's what it is. If you agree on these things, and there's a lot of these things, by the way, and he's really emphatic on, if you fully agree on these things, then give me your hand, right? It behooves Christians not to apply this kind of anything goes approach to their doctrine. And the thing is, there are moral issues where we just can't accept it. We cannot accept polyamory, for instance. There's a movement for that. We can't accept, the acceptance of child pornography. And amazingly enough, there are some people trying to mainstream that. I mean, that's just mind-boggling, by the way. I just can't even get my head around that. There's certain things where we need to put our foot down and say, no, this goes beyond the pale. So, but the other things like, all right, for instance, should we help the poor? The answer is yes.
Mhm.
How do you help the poor? That's where that's where the discussion needs to be.
Mhm.
And it's in that discussion then, based off of your shared faith and treating one another as baptized Christians, then you can have the kind of dialogue where you can say, okay, I think, we should do this, this, and this. And somebody says, well, I don't think that's enough, or I think that's too much. Christians can debate each other on the tax rate. That's okay.
Mhm.
It is not some holy cow that we can't touch,
Right.
Vilifying the rich is wrong, just as vilifying the poor is wrong. I hope, I think you just need to kind of build off of that core, and then you can move to, and acknowledge there are certain things, like, I realize that there's some debate on this, but I have a hard time with Christians supporting the death penalty.
Mhm.
I don't know any Christians who think that abortion itself is a good thing. Now, some might disagree on its accessibility and the content and the context in when it can be accessed, or assessed. But I don't know any Christian who would say that is a good thing. Now,
Right.
there are some political ideologies that say it is a good thing, but I think that's really outside of the Christian pale here.
Right.
There was a clergy person, not a Methodist, who said abortion is a blessing. That's not how Christians talk. That's like saying war is a blessing. No, war is wrong. And in fact, Wesley actually said war is one of the surest examples of original sin.
Yes.
So Christians should not be eager to go to war. Now, is there the just war tradition within the faith? Yes. Now, if you can find a war that actually checks all the boxes of the just war theory, that would be interesting. I don't know if we've ever had one. I mean, World War II might come the closest, but still,
Yeah, right.
It's a stretch.
Well, it could be then that, you've got the wheels turning for me. So I could imagine a group of people in a local church. They know they're politically interested. They tend to be the more, the people who are staying in touch on a daily basis. And if they would be willing to try a group picking a topic like poverty, something that isn't quite so raw and sensitive to people.
Yeah.
And then thinking through their what they believe to be the best approach to addressing poverty, and then talking with one another about how they came to those viewpoints, scripture, whatever else they have in mind, and using it as a way of revealing to themselves how they think about these things. That might be one way that a local church could actually begin to act in a penitent way about some of these things and start to make some progress in the healing.
You know what I would do? The way I would approach this is I would do it in small groups, no more than 20.
Mm-hmm.
And it'd be nice actually if they did it in home groups and had a meal together before they talked.
Right.
Everybody bring, if a Methodist can't put together a potluck or a covered dish, then there's a problem, right? It's more than just politics. If you eat together and then you actually pray for one another, I think those kind of community things need to be involved just as much as, everybody get out your Bible and let's jump into the political topic. I think because community is something that our political sphere doesn't have anymore. And I think that's part of the problem. You think back to, Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan sat at the bar together and drank beer. I cannot imagine President Trump and the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi. I can't imagine them sitting down for a drink together, whether it was coffee or something stronger, And we've moved to a place where we won't eat with those people,
Right.
So if you have to eat with those people and you have to pray for those people,
Mhm.
I think that's a more Wesleyan approach. And I think it's an approach that might bear some fruit, actually.
Yeah.
I'd love to hear somebody out there tries that. That would be very interesting.
Yeah, and I'm guessing there are people, groups that are trying it. I think my worry about Methodism a lot of times is that we know we just need to be nice to people, and there's a real commitment to just being nice.
Mm,
And that the temptation there then is to avoid talking about certain things when in fact we need to talk about these things and talk about them Christianly.
yeah, my classes, I call niceness the primary heresy of modern Methodism.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, that's our first heresy. Our second heresy is Pelagianism. We think you have to earn your own salvation, which you
Yeah.
don't.
Yeah. Good point.
So,
Well, when we were prepping a little bit for this conversation, I mentioned this last question, which I think I will forego about Wesley's view of liberty. We'll save that one for another time.
all right.
And maybe end where we began, and that is there is something known as that we can identify as political theology. It's really thinking as Christians about I'll use the term common good. That's not how you put it, but there are clear social implications to receiving the gospel and to living the gospel, and that we bear a certain kind of responsibility for the community beyond the church,
Right.
that our Wesleyan tradition of thinking about these things could help us. So thank you a lot, Ryan. I reserve the right to ask you again for another conversation where we do talk about Wesley and the colonies and liberty and independency and those things.
I'd be happy to do it.
Okay. All right. Thanks a lot. Take care. Thank you, folks.